Here on BBC Two, a Newsnight special. John Tuser talks to leading defence experts about new ideas for a NATO strategy that could lead to a nuclear-free Europe.
Good evening. NATO's existing defence strategy is suicidal, misguided, and above all, unnecessary. That's the conclusion not of Britain's campaign for nuclear disarmament, nor of the West German Green Movement, nor of an assorted band of peaceniks, neutralists, or fellow travellers. It is the conclusion reached by, and increasingly voiced by, a group of former senior NATO commanders and Western politicians who've started what's called the defence debate of the decade. If anything opened this debate, it was the emerging realization that NATO's nuclear weapons in Western Europe were being held not in order to deter, but because they might have to be used in practice, an inconceivable proposition.
No one, no human being that I'm aware of, has been able to put down on paper a plan for utilizing nuclear weapons in response to a Soviet conventional attack that does not have a high probability of suicide. That is to say, a high probability of moving to unlimited nuclear war which would destroy Western civilization.
You can't use a weapon which kills you against somebody. Nuclear weapon will lead to the world catastrophe, to the end of the civilization. That's not the weapon. You can't use it.
Nuclear war is almost infinitely more terrible than any other thing that we've ever witnessed. There are even credible scientific studies now which give serious question as to whether the effects, the long-term effects, are not very much worse even than what we already know.
Such Western figures as Robert McNamara, the former US Defense Secretary, and Admiral Guyler, former head of the National Security Agency, only a part of a body of dissent at the highest level, who, while totally committed to NATO and the Atlantic Alliance, now argue that NATO cannot rely on its present policies. Earlier this month, NATO's Supreme Commander, General Bernard Rogers, warned bluntly that in the event of a conventional Warsaw Pact attack, NATO would be forced to retaliate relatively fast with nuclear weapons. And Robert McNamara recently condemned NATO's strategies in a major article. He said they increase the risk of nuclear war and added, "You cannot build a credible deterrent on an incredible action." That incredible action is to threaten to turn West Germany into a nuclear desert in order to prevent a Warsaw Pact tank victory. But the objections aren't simply negative. Increasingly, the highly placed critics of present strategies argue that a conventional defense alternative to present policies exists and that such a defense can deter any feared attack. If these views win the day, they could lead to a fundamental shift in defense thinking and even in the foreign policies that go with it. It's these arguments and the objections they face that we're examining in this program.
Hello, 112 Alpha, contact 0902 hours. Agreed 808869. Tanks moving westward. I'm observing, over.
One roger. How many tanks? Over.
12 Alpha, 10 or 12, maybe more. The mist is very thick. I can hear a lot of noise. I'm awaiting sight of them. Over.
All assumptions about a future war in Europe start with a massed Soviet tank attack. NATO is trained to anticipate it, its operations designed to respond to it. This is what will happen when the Warsaw Pact armoured blitzkrieg begins. The official NATO scenario assumes that some 20,000 tanks would surge across the West German frontier in at least 4 main armoured thrusts. Their intention would be to reach the Atlantic coast within a fortnight, preempting diplomatic efforts at a ceasefire by the speed of their advance. In stage 1, NATO would try to check the onslaught using conventional weapons, as close to the West German border as possible, the forward defence it is committed to. But few commanders believe that this is possible with existing forces. So in stage 2, NATO would respond by what it calls taking counters, advancing into East Germany to take territory hostage against territory already lost. Then, as Warsaw Pact armour brushed aside NATO defences, The Western Alliance would resort to what it calls deep strike into East Germany and beyond at the enemy's follow-on forces. But by this stage, or even before, as Soviet advances continued, NATO would have turned to first use of battlefield nuclear weapons. The Warsaw Pact would reply, and according to a UN study, an exchange of 1,700 battlefield weapons, less than a fifth of the available total, aimed at military targets alone, would cause 6 million immediate civilian casualties, 1 million civilians affected by radiation, and 400,000 military casualties. And worse still, if worse it could be, such a so-called limited battlefield exchange would not be contained.
The level of destruction, of course, would be enormous, unimaginable. Right now, the United States has 6,000 nuclear weapons in Europe. France and Great Britain have their weapons. The Russians can match all of ours. You could destroy Europe in a very, very short time. You could never defend Europe with those weapons.
And what would then happen as far as escalation of the use of nuclear weapons is concerned?
My view, it would be almost certain. You have to consider the fog of battle, the fact that those on the receiving end of nuclear weapons, they don't know that they're benign tactical weapons. All they know is that they have enormous explosions going on all over the place. And the Russians don't officially recognize the idea of a limited nuclear war anyway. So the escalation would be very probable.
So your conclusion from this is that nuclear war in the Central European theater is simply not fightable?
That's correct. It is a monstrous and empty bluff.
And though he's hardly a detached observer, General Milstein's judgment has an uncomfortable ring of realism to it.
Just think that you are using a nuclear weapon to stop a tank attack, and the result, the end of a country. Annihilation of millions of people in order to stop the tank attack. That's not the rational decision, I guess. The theory and the concept and the doctrine of a first use, as it is now accepted by NATO, it's an obsolete thinking and obsolete idea.
The cruise missiles, now only 2 months away from installation at Greenham Common, are only the most visible element of a nuclear defense strategy that is raising anxieties far wider than the membership of the peace movement or CND. For many in Western Europe, such a strategy appears unusable and, as a result, incredible to the enemy. In West Germany, the peace movement is large, well organized, and has sunk deep roots into popular culture. Later this month, a whole week of anti-nuclear demonstrations is planned throughout West Germany. For the peace movement incarnates a further weakness of present NATO strategy. It's not just that military men believe it's unusable. It does not command full public acceptance. It exposes a profound flaw in NATO's political support.
90% of the German population are for NATO, but 70% are against the nuclear strategy. This is the reason that we have to change something in the elements and in the objectives of this strategy. And this is the reason for the big peace movement we have in Germany, 3 million people. But I had many discussions with these young people in many lectures, and they agree in conventional defense to do more for conventional defense, to have the chance not to come in the nuclear holocaust.
In West Germany, General Lohse is prominent among those who believe that NATO's battlefield nuclear armory is dangerous and unusable. Strike aircraft like the F-111 can deliver up to 1,000 nuclear bombs. Missiles such as Lance are fitted with a further 1,000 weapons. With 2,000 nuclear artillery shells and other devices, NATO's nuclear stockpile in Europe comes to 6,000 warheads. Latest plans indicate an intended United States total nuclear stockpile of 11,000 within the decade. Cruise and Pershing II will add range, flexibility and firepower to even this huge arsenal. But opponents of the new missiles believe that such additions actually reduce NATO's strategic choices and box the alliance into a position where nuclear weapons have to be used. Many now argue for a no early use strategy. Some go further and insist on a NATO no first use strategy. It is not, they maintain, a formula for weakness.
Now, no first use would have an effect in the real physical world. It would be more than a declaration. It would result in the redeployment of weapons. It would result in a reliance on conventional rather than nuclear weapons, and in changes in doctrine and so forth, which, by the way, would be very observable on both sides of the line.
Critics object that a no first use declaration leaves Western Europe open to nuclear blackmail by the Soviet Union and its SS-20s. These weapons, with their triple warheads, could be used not only to destroy NATO's cruise and Pershing IIs in a preemptive strike, but would leave weapons to spare for a further strike. But advocates of a no first use policy for NATO reply with 2 points. The first is that NATO will still be backed by an invulnerable submarine-based nuclear force.
We have today, and we will surely maintain in the future, an absolutely invulnerable second strike capability, which is the deterrent to the Soviet first use. They would be committing suicide, and I don't believe they wish to commit suicide. They would be committing suicide if they were ever to initiate the use of nuclear weapons against us. They know that.
The second reply is that the higher you push your nuclear threshold, the riskier it is for your enemy to cross it.
The inhibition against using the first weapon is great for the reasons I said. You may bring the nuclear retaliation down on your head. The second reason is that when General Alexander Haig made the statement that NATO had plans to make such a demonstration of its resolve with a nuclear weapon, he was nearly laughed out of existence. People understood how futile and dangerous such a demonstration would be. Why would it be any more effective or persuasive by the Russians than by the West?
The core of the alternative defense strategy is the new generation of conventional weapons now available. They include anti-tank helicopters, infantry anti-tank weapons, ground sensors to warn of an enemy advance, and a communications revolution based on microprocessors. By spending money on such weapons, it is argued, NATO can revolutionize the battlefield towards the sort of war it would prefer to fight, and tilt the actual balance of advantage in favor of the defenders in an entirely new way.
There are new families of anti-tank weapons that should be coming forward and convince the Soviets that their tank attacks, which are probably their most effective threat, cannot succeed.
What sort of new weapons are available?
Oh, the one that impresses me most is the air-sowable anti-tank mine. It's a very small device that can be dropped from airplanes in large numbers along the avenue of advance of a tank column, and each one of those little mines is lethal. It will disable a tank, kill its crew, or blow the treads off of it in every case.
We have a lot of evidence that hitting weapons are a practical thing. We have battlefield evidence where an early version, the Russian Sagar, just cleaned up Israeli armed forces, for example, armor forces. The technology has improved greatly. We don't have these things fully in the forces or even fully tried, but there's no question in my mind that the new capability to target, the new capability for reconnaissance, the new capability to have weapons that hit instead of weapons that miss makes a tremendous difference on the battlefield, as indeed it does at sea.
And there's evidence to suggest that General Milstein is not being falsely reassuring when he advances this belief.
Well, I think real NATO commanders who know the reality and know the capacity and know the experience of the Middle East war, they know for sure, and I'm sure of it, that the effectiveness of the contemporary tank weapon, anti-tank weapon, in such a high level that any tank attack could be stopped by contemporary anti-tank weapons without any nuclear weapon.
The argument goes a stage further. The new conventional weapons allow a new defense strategy to be adopted. Whatever happens, weapons, this land in West Germany will be the battlefield in a future European war. A harsh fact, but an incontestable one. At least NATO could have a choice about what sort of war it is, if war there has to be.
You have two possibilities: the nuclear holocaust, as today, by the first use of theater weapons, or a longer non-nuclear war.
What the West Germans have got to face up to is that if they continue to apply NATO strategy, they will be a totally devastated society. And one of the first Germans to recognize that has been General Steinhoff, the former commander of the German Luftwaffe, who has said publicly that he is absolutely, unequivocally, unqualifiedly opposed to the use of nuclear weapons on German soil. That is totally contrary to existing NATO strategy. He's absolutely correct.
This conventional battlefield would itself be carefully designed to be limited to the lines formed by the rivers Weser and Lech. Within this zone, a conventional attack could be absorbed, checked, and turned round. West German theorists point to the known effectiveness of prepared defensive tank positions. They call for a system of minefields and earthworks whose effect would be to channel the enemy advance into limited killing grounds.
When you find a combination between will, firepower, defense in a deep net, you have the chance that defense can win. And this is a high risk for the Warsaw Pact to lose 2 or 3 weeks or longer, to come in attrition, to lose these tanks, to have logistic and other difficulties in your depths, to know that your allies in the Warsaw Pact don't agree with your attack, and when they lose time, they lose the war.
How important psychologically is it for NATO to have a defense posture which is only defensive?
I recognize that some weapons can be used both ways, but if we equip in the main, train, deploy our forces in a way which is very clearly defensive, then I think it reduces the impression that the Warsaw Pact has that we may well be preparing to attack them. We sometimes tend to look at this problem only from our own point of view. We know what our intentions are. We know we're good people. We're not going to attack. But that view isn't always accepted on the other side of the fence. They certainly see some potential for a NATO attack, and as a result, the fear level goes up, the pressure for improved forces goes up on both sides, and we're in this very foolish, destructive, and wasteful arms race to confront each other in Europe.
Skeptics protest that NATO has turned to nuclear weapons for 20 years because it won't pay for the added costs of developing conventional weapons. Advocates of the new defense deny that cost is a real barrier.
We believe strongly that there are improvements needed in the conventional forces which defend NATO, but that such improvements can be effected and afforded. I was the officer responsible for the security of 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe several years ago, and I know how much money we spend guarding those every day. I know how much money we spend training our forces to use them, equipping and certifying them as competent with nuclear weapons. There is far more than 4% savings in NATO expenditures if we simply abandon this foolish reliance on nuclear weapons to defend us and convert those resources into more effective conventional means.
I'm not naive. I know the fiscal pressures that exist today in all of the NATO nations. And we must, if we are to increase the conventional forces, as I believe we must do so within these fiscal constraints. I believe we can. Recent studies joined in by military and political leaders of Britain, Germany, the U.S., and certain other NATO nations have concluded that at a very modest cost, say in total for all nations over 4 to 5 years, roughly $20 billion, or say 1% increase in the real cost of NATO defense would provide the necessary increment of conventional strength. I think General Rogers, the Supreme Allied Commander, has prepared independently estimates that yield about the same answer, and recent studies by Professor Kaufman of Massachusetts Institute of Technology have come to exactly the same conclusion.
But is there a deep political flaw in the new thinking? Does it decouple Western Europe from the West's ultimate defense, the US strategic deterrent, the force of Minuteman and eventually MX missiles that threaten the Soviet Union with ultimate destruction?
Faced with the development of weapons with immense destructive power, we've no choice but to maintain ready defense forces that are second to none.
Does it mean that an American president's willingness to risk America's destruction in the cause of Europe's defense would be undermined?
I think that's just backwards. It seems to me that it is difficult to believe that the Americans will start a nuclear war over a conventional attack. But it is not at all difficult to believe that the American troops in place and the rest of us will fight like hell in a conventional war, so that the coupling is created by the conventional defense. People understand that the commitment to joining in a NATO defense by the United States in terms of the troops we have over here is absolute. The commitment to go to nuclear war is iffy.
From my personal point of view, it's an artificial problem. Because according to the potential capacity of the contemporary nuclear arsenal, you don't have to make any additional deployment in order to show or to prove the coupling of the American and NATO, what they call political
guarantee.
There are enough. There are enough forces for this.
The experience of the recent Korean airliner disaster lends force to the arguments of the new school of defense thinkers. That was, they argue, a classic instance of what happens when a particular military solution is built into rigid decision-taking procedures. If, by analogy, NATO's readiness to resort to battlefield nuclear weapons is similarly built into equally elaborate procedures, as it must be, then no one should be surprised if those weapons are used in practice.
But we've seen what happens when one follows rigid instructions with an automaticity of the kind that was applied in that situation. One sees what happens when mistakes of judgment are made, but when one seeks to deny the error and simply pursues an erroneous course. Now, it was tragic when it happened with a civilian airplane carrying 269 people. It would be catastrophic if those similar errors occurred in connection with nuclear weapons.
There is no safety or security in building forces which are prepared to prevail in nuclear war. And that's what both sides are intent upon doing right now, prevailing in a nuclear war. If we proceed along this course, we're going to fail, and we're going to have the very nuclear war that we say we must deter.
There are many shades of opinion in this debate, which is still in its early stages. There are those who see it as making West Germany a land fit for conventional war, a pretty poor prospect. There's the distinction between those who think a no first use strategy is desirable, and the more cautious who want merely a no early use of nuclear weapons. Then there's the distinction between those who want the conventional war to be carried deep into enemy territory, the sort of concepts officially enshrined in the NATO scenarios called Airland Battle 2000, and those who insist that it must all stop at the West German border. Well, these are elements that have to be debated and refined. Essentially, though, the first psychological, theoretical step away from dependence on nuclear weapons in Western Europe has been taken. It's hard to see the ebb away from the nuclear battlefield stopping there. Good night.
Well, John Tusser writes about nuclear-free zones in next week's edition of the Listener magazine.
A major documentary series for the autumn on BBC Two. Aristocrats, about some of the richest and most powerful people in Europe. There's Prince Franz Joseph of Liechtenstein.
With powers similar to those of Britain's constitutional monarchs, the Liechtensteins have a claim to being Europe's most successful aristocrats, for they've risen above being just landowners. They are ruling princes, and that makes them members of a very exclusive club indeed.
The Duke of Westminster, one of the richest men in Britain.
I don't think the title helps me at all. I think the only advantage of being a duke, it does help in a crowded restaurant when you're trying to get a table.
The Duchess of Medina Celi of Spain, who's uncertain how many titles she has.
50, I should think. Because I gave my children some titles. I distributed them. So now I haven't counted them. I don't know how many are left.
The series begins in France with the de Gannat family preparing for a wedding.
The Gannats say it's only a quiet wedding. Just 1,000 guests stand for the evening from Paris.
Comte et Comtesse François de Montalembert. Comte et Comtesse Arnaud de Montalembert.
Aristocrats, a touch of splendor for the autumn on BBC Two.
Now on to, we go back to 1931, the year of F.S. Smythe's British expedition to conquer Mount Carmel in the Himalayas. Our travellers in time are introduced as usual by Duncan Cass.